Good afternoon. Today is March 2nd, 2017. My name is Sally, and I am here at the Newton City Hall with Irwin Thompson. Together, we are participating in the Newton Talks Oral History Project that is being conducted with the Newton Free Library, Historic Newton, and the Newton Senior Center. Okay, the first question is, what is your connection to Newton?
Well, I've lived in Newton now for quite a few years. Let me see. I moved here to be here, to live here, and I've been here now more than 20 years.
Okay, what were you doing before you entered the service, or what was life like for you before you entered the service?
Well, I was an academic physician on the West Coast, University of Washington in Seattle, and after that I continued my life in academia, moving to Stockholm, and then I was drafted from Stockholm, and that was in 1968, so now we're going back quite a few years.
Okay, what did you miss most about home aside from family and friends?
Well, I've been traveling around forever, as it were, because I grew up in Scotland. And I went to medical school at the University of Glasgow, and from there I went to the West Coast. I lived there for 5 years, so I was always moving around, following my academic interests and my scholarly interests, and so I actually left my family pretty early when I was like 22 years of age in Scotland, and at that point I moved to Tennessee for a year.
Oh, okay. How did you join, and why did you choose the specific branch of the military?
Well, I was a physician, and at the time that I was drafted, it was the Vietnam War, and the Army was desperately short of physicians. So they were scouring the planet for people who were eligible, and I was eligible because I was a legal immigrant to the United States, and at that point, like I said, I was actually living in Sweden, but they were desperate for doctors, and they tracked me down. So it was a complicated system because living in Sweden, I had the option to not return to the United States or allow myself to be drafted, and then I would be eligible for, if I so chose, to become a citizen of the United States. So it was a very complex situation where I could have stayed in Sweden, and I had a job, and I was actually doing a PhD. But if I didn't accept the commission that was offered at that time, the terminology that they used was that I would be declared an undesirable alien and would never be readmitted to the United States. So it was a whole different world then, because you had to follow the rules, and they did that. That's what they did, because I knew several people who had declined to be able to allow themselves to be drafted, and then later they wanted to come back into the States and they weren't allowed in. So things were different back then. I can tell you that for sure.
How did you adapt to military life, including the physical regime, or regimen, barracks, food, and social life?
Well, I was married with one child, so I'm sure in some ways that made the adaptation easier. Secondly, I was situated in what was called the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, which is actually the biggest army hospital outside of the United States, biggest army hospital in the world outside the United States. So it was a huge, complicated operation. Back then they had over 100 physicians, they still do, and over 200 nurses, so it was very, very complex, and it was like working in a major academic hospital, which is what I'd sort of done all of my life. So that part of it was easy. Number one. Number two, again, because of their system, which is hard for you all to understand as I talk about it because it's so weird. Uh, I had been drafted as a captain, and because I graduated from medical school at a very early age. The system in the Army then, I have no idea what it is now, but then they promoted you from when you started medical school. And I actually started medical school when I was 16 and a half years of age. I like to joke that I was a boyhood genius. But anyway, because I had started medical school so early, once I got in there, they kept promoting me. And that was actually quite horrifying to the regular Army staff who were there because, for example, they made me a major in 8 weeks, and the other majors that were there had been 8 years in the Army, and now I was of a rank with them. And actually, 4 weeks later, 6 weeks later, they made me a lieutenant colonel. So, I mean, that was really a big deal. So these kinds of advances, on the one hand, they made my life a little difficult in terms of getting on with the rest of the staff. We had 9 doctors in our unit. I was an OBGYN. We had 9 doctors in our unit. So some of it made it difficult. On the other hand, I was a very hard-working person, and they could see that, and that made their lives easier, and so on and so forth like that. So it was kind of a balance where it all worked out, but it was a little difficult in the beginning because of the fact that my rapid promotions did cause a little problem. On the other hand, it's better to be promoted than not.
Where was the hospital where you were stationed?
It's about 40 miles from Heidelberg. So it's actually in a beautiful part of the countryside. And there was a small village, still is, but it's growing a lot. It's actually called Landstuhl. There's the name of it there, Landstuhl. And Landstuhl is adjacent to the Ramstein Air Force Base, which is the biggest Air Force base in the world outside the United States. So it was a very well set up, the total facility was very well set up for conducting U.S. foreign policy in Germany because Ramstein, warriors who were wounded in Vietnam, which was when I was in service, were flown directly after their initial battlefield therapy, were flown directly to Ramstein and admitted to our hospital. So in addition to all the usual thing of hospitals, we had a huge emergency department doing primary surgery in these poor wounded guys. And we also had a reserve MASH unit, and I was in part of that reserve MASH unit, which was always on call to be sent to Vietnam if we had to do that.
How did you stay in touch with families and friends back home?
Well, that was a difficult part because being there in the military, it was easy enough to call or write or whatever. My family lived in Scotland, so that part was relatively easy communication-wise. But of course, there was no computers, no emails, nothing like that. So by hand, I guess is what you would say.
Yeah. Where exactly did you serve? Do you remember arriving, and what was it like? You talked a little bit about where, but...
Well, yeah, in fact, it's even more complicated than I outlined to you. When I was in Sweden, the first thing I had to do was to go back to Fort Sam Houston in Texas. All military inductees, I mean physician inductees, were processed through Fort Sam Houston. So I had to go back there, Fort Sam Houston, and undergo basic training and orientation to the military for 6 weeks. And that's where I was in the beginning. That was the first thing. The second thing was, once you're in the Army, I know this is hard for you to understand, but you have to do what they say. So when I was first drafted, I had an official letter saying that I was going to be drafted to Germany, but that I had to go back to Texas, and my initial obligation would be for 2 years. Once I got to Texas, within like 5 days, they informed me that my orders had been changed and that I was going to Europe for 3 years. Or they always give you options. Or I could go to Vietnam for 2 years. So this is how they do it. Now I want you to understand, I'm not criticizing the military in any way. I'm actually pro-military in many ways. But forget about following civilian rules. It doesn't exist. You just do what you're told. Now, I think it's still the same way to some extent. Not to that extent, because that was pretty drastic, but that's what happened to me. So once I got there, everything changed. Where I was going, how long I was going, and blah, 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 like that. So that was difficult. Mm-hmm. Because once I got there, all the rules were changed on me, and I wasn't allowed any options.
Tell me about a few of your most memorable experiences, positive or negative.
Well, there were a lot of very positive things because I had a very long academic background, and so I was chosen for a number of projects there in the hospital, which, as I said, was really a major hospital. So I started up a specialized infertility clinic, which they never had in all the years that they'd been there. And so very early in the game, I was just flooded with tons of patients. We took care of all the dependents, and let's see, I had written this down for my information before. We basically took care of at least 50,000 military personnel, families scattered throughout Germany, and they were, for major problems or major issues, they all came to our hospital. So once I started this clinic, we were just overwhelmed with patients who had no kind of medical care like that before, because again, you have to understand, within the structure of the army there, and it's still the same thing, dependents they're very well treated, but they're not thought of as being the primary mission of the army. Mm-hmm. So the primary mission is to train soldiers, keep them battle ready, and then dependents, and that includes women and children, families, are sort of second tier, but I don't mean to be too critical when I say that, because they get the finest medical care and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of fell into all that. It was waiting to be developed by somebody who had experience with academic medicine, and that was me, basically.
Do you recall the day your service ended?
It was approximately September the 3rd in 1971. There was a little, I say approximately because there was a little screw up backwards and forwards whether I was going to be out on the 1st or the 5th or whatever, and I just let the Department of Civilians or whatever it was solve that problem. I just did what I was told at that point, because it was hard to leave.
Yeah. What was it like to return to civilian life?
Well, it was completely new for me, because at that point I came to Boston for the first time in my life, and so that was the first time I'd been to Boston and Massachusetts. As I said, I'd spent except for a year, all my time on the West Coast. So I was very West Coast oriented. I'd been up and down the whole West Coast. I'd never been to Massachusetts. And I had a teaching appointment at Harvard from being in the Army. Again, that's kind of an unusual situation, but because of my academic achievements before I went into the Army, this guy at the Brigham and Harvard had been following my career, and so he offered me a job here. But I came here in 1971.
How did your service and experiences affect your life and your outlook on the war and the military in general?
Well, they changed my life totally and utterly because at the time I was drafted, I was on an academic path. I was doing a PhD in Sweden. I was kind of a peacenik. Uh, my wife then wife, was a leading American peacenik in Stockholm. So she was quite prominent in that, and I was working away in my academic thing. When I look back on it, if I had had any sense, I would have joined her in the front rank of the marchers marching through Stockholm because the CIA were filming all of that, and I would have been on record as whatever. They probably wouldn't have drafted me, you see. But of course, I wasn't clever enough to do that. So I changed from being this academic wonk to being, uh, I mean, I was right in the thick of things, right in the thick of the military. Things were happening all the time. They were constantly threatening to send our mass unit to Vietnam. And I was busy as hell in a whole different environment, just doing stuff. And I enjoyed it in many ways because I felt I was making a real contribution. And as I say, I set up all these new departments and things, which were very useful to a lot of people. So that always gives you a good feeling.
What would you like people to know 100 years from now?
To know?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not a great believer in these sorts of issues because I think when you look at things historically, people have a whole different idea of how they were when people look at them historically. They're not usually as good as they thought they were. I I don't think in those terms. I live for the moment, and 100 years from now, I'll be like all of us. We'll be gone.
So it looks like our time is just about up.
Already?
Is there anything else
I'm
you'd
just
like
starting.
to? Is there anything else you'd like to say? We have plenty of time. But
Oh,
yeah.
we have time.
We're out of the questions.
Oh, you're out of questions.
Yeah.
Oh.
If there's more you'd like to share, please.
Well,
continue.
Oh, you can ask me any questions you want as far as that goes. I would say that I didn't touch upon the fact that I do have a high regard for the military, and I donate to a lot of veterans organizations. I'm not actively involved with any vets, and I get a lot of letters from the local vets and stuff like that. But I don't participate in that sort of a thing because, I mean, I was in academic medicine for 30 years. That was more of what the nature of my life was, and then when I retired, or before I retired, I was an artist. I still am an artist. I'm a very active artist here in the city of Newton. So that's kind of where my preoccupation is. But I do have a high regard for the military. I support them with donations and all the stuff and other things that I do to indicate the fact that I hold them in high regard.
Would you talk a little more about your art?
Sure. Let's see, I've been an artist now for 25 years. I do contemporary, what I call contemporary abstraction. And I'm very involved with that, and I've had a lot of art shows in New England. I've been a member of different galleries, 5 or 6 different galleries. I've had several shows at the New Art Center here in Newton. And I have a very active website. You can check it out right now if you want. I didn't bring my card. It's Irwin E. Thompson Art.com. And if you look at it, you'll see that I cover a range of topics, all done in an abstract and contemporary art way. So I'm very involved with that. I have a studio in Newton Upper Falls, historic Newton Upper Falls, and I go there just about every day, and I sort of paint every day. And then locally in this part of Newton, I always participate in Newton Open Studios, and this year I'm at the new art center in Newton Open Studios. So that's what I'll be doing.
It's really cool. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Not specifically. I'm open to answering any kinds of questions, but
What did you learn from treating wounded soldiers?
well, don't forget I was treating mostly the dependents,
Okay, yeah.
the wives, but uh, again, the army had its own peculiar system for dealing with all these things. I do know a lot about how the army worked in Germany. First of all, I was European anyway, so being Scottish, I was always familiar with events of the war, the Second World War. I'm going to come back to that question you asked me in a minute, but in fact, I lived through the Second World War in Scotland. I was just a young child then, and where I lived, Glasgow, was the second most bombed city in the United Kingdom, because Glasgow was the center of shipbuilding for the British Empire and for the British effort in the Second World War. So we were targets by the Nazis, and so we used to have to get up at night, and the air raid shelters would be screeching and the flashlights flashing. You could hear the bombs falling. We used to have to get up at night. We slept with bags under our beds, jump out of bed, grab our bag, and head for the air raid shelter. So I was always knowledgeable about the Second World War and all the things that happened and that came from that and so on, involving Europe. Germany, of course, was terribly destroyed in the Second World War, but they rebuilt thanks to American money.
Mm.
That's what the American war effort post-war was, mostly in Europe, was to rebuild Germany because they recognized it as a powerhouse. And this is one of the ironical things, for example, at the end of the Second World War, Britain, with all the heroism that they had and all the people that were slaughtered, they owed the United States over $100 billion. And the United States made Britain pay that all back. Whereas Germany, which was so deeply in debt and everything, we rebuilt it. So I was very much aware of all that stuff because I was also a history buff and I looked at all these things. So when I was in Germany, I was aware of all these different kind of aspects of what the relationship between Britain, Germany, and the U.S. was.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a lot of financial stuff. So when I was serving there, I could see all the money that the United States was pouring into rebuilding Germany and rebuilding the German economy. And I mean, you can see the results now. Germany is the strongest economic power in Europe, and Britain is one of the worst. So that has persisted since the Second World War.
Do you think like growing up through the Second World War had any impact on your views of the military?
Not really, because everybody who was growing up in Scotland at that time knew somebody who'd been killed in the war. And my own uncle was killed when he was 18. He was a sailor, and he was on the first convoy to sail across the Atlantic from Scotland to the United States, and his ship went down. They were the first convoy to be exposed to U-2 attacks. So that was a massacre. They lost, I think, something like 70 ships.
Wow.
From that one convoy, and they all went down. It was the Bay of Biscay, and it was stormy and all. So they all went down. Nobody survived. So I had an uncle that happened to. And my own grandfather, he was in the First World War, and he was heavily wounded in Germany during the First World War. When he came back, he was completely war damaged and was hospitalized for a while, and then he came out, and he had absolutely classic PTSD. But of course, it wasn't known that was a syndrome back then, and so people just said, everybody in Scotland talked like that. They said they'd been in the war and it got to them. That was the phrase they used. It meant that everybody who had that experience had PTSD were basically a little crazy. And there was no medical therapy, whatever, like that. So yeah, I direct family experience with that with my grandfather and cousin.
Definitely. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, just to say, as I said, the military, I think, they do a great job. It's a very different life, and if you've had no exposure to it, you can't understand what the discipline of the military means to the people in it, for better or for worse. I mean, the better part is if you do your job, you're going to be compensated and they're going to look after your family. The worst part is if you have to go to war, Middle East, Afghanistan, whatever, people back home, unless they're aware of it, they don't really pay that much attention to it. And I don't know how much they care, frankly.
Well, just thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us.
It's my pleasure.
We're really happy to be able to include you in the Newton Talks Oral History Project.
I'm happy to be here and to give you my point of view.
Thank you.
After formally finishing their interview, the participant shared another story, which will follow without introduction here.
As I said, Landstuhl is the biggest army hospital in the world outside the United States. And the big thing was, and the reason I got sidetracked was I was discussing a little bit about once you're in the army, it's a whole different world that if you've never had any exposure to it through relatives or directly, you can't begin to understand. So the army had a policy that, first of all of the draftees who were sent immediately to Vietnam, they were all young kids from the Midwest. They had basically no experience from life. They were drafted out of high school, having lived in the Midwest all their life. I don't know if anybody has lived in the Midwest, but it's different. From both coasts, I've lived in both coasts, and my daughter lives in Chicago, and I've been all around the Midwest. So these young men who were just like, as it were, the salt of the earth, because they were so good and they were trained and disciplined and so on and so forth, they were sucked up and sent to Vietnam. And they had no idea what was happening to them. They all got on drugs and all kinds of things. The Army made a political decision that those who were severely wounded would not be brought back directly to the United States because they were afraid. First of all, as some of you know, or may know, there was tremendous opposition to the Vietnam War. Tremendous. And so the Army figured out that if they brought back all these, what had been healthy young men who were now basket cases, drug addicts, and who had been physically wounded, you can imagine what that was like, and what it would be like if they were brought back here and deposited. I mean, imagine like in Newton if there were suddenly 50 kids like that. Everybody would know about it, there would be all kinds of demonstrations, whatever. So they, in fact, were brought back to Landstuhl for psychotherapy. Or physical therapy, I mean physical treatment if they needed it, but also we had a huge psychotherapy unit. So you would see like little cavalcades of guys walking around totally lost in space and stuff like that. And I go out and sort of walk around them. You weren't actually allowed to talk to them. So here was I, an army, in the army, an officer in the army, and high-ranking officer. I'm not allowed to talk to these. Now they weren't my patients directly, but they were clear debris and evidence of the war. So that was something that I was very much aware of them because I saw them every day walking in the grounds, and they were all basket cases. So that was very difficult for me because I felt that the Army was doing what it could, but they needed intense psychotherapy, and they certainly weren't getting that. And PTSD, even then, wasn't really a recognized illness as it is now. So there was no specific therapy. And by the way, that's still a big lack in the military, not just the Army, but all the military, because I know a couple of shrinks who work in the military, and PTSD is kind of a subject that's swept under the carpet. So I was very aware of that at that time, not having that label, but I was very aware of large numbers of very young American males being sequestered over there until they had 6 months of so-called psychotherapy before they were brought back. All kinds of stuff like that that I was aware of, but couldn't do anything about it, and you certainly didn't want to walk around talking about it, or you'd be completely ostracized.
Do you know at all what the psychotherapy consisted of?
Well, it was very basic. First of all, we didn't have a huge number of shrinks there, and they needed. I mean, when you have that kind of situation, you need pretty intense one-on-one psychotherapy. We still don't have that, by the way. If you watch any of these programs and all these scandals about veterans affairs here, right now, right today in this country, these people are not being treated properly. And this is all these years later.
Thank you.
I hope it don't sound too depressing.
No, it's
It's hard to
interesting.
give